All right. So I'm going to talk about some of the run up to World War II and then some of the beginning of it. So the war never really ended, the Great War never really ended in a number of ways, and then it restarted in a number of ways, and I'll discuss how that occurred. So, one aspect of the Great War aftermath was the rise of totalitarians in the interwar period. But there's one totalitarian, obviously, who's much more important. But all of these contributed to a atmosphere of illiberalism. So here's Benito Mussolini from Italy. This is Francisco Franco from Spain, and Joseph Stalin in the Soviet Union. All of these people would have started, well, maybe not so much Franco, but definitely Mussolini and Stalin would have started wars. They wanted to go to war and wanted to expand their territory. That was something that all of these dictators shared. They also all shared a disdain for liberal democracy. They all thought it was basically a sham and stood up to the Western world in a variety of ways. However, none of these people on their own or together would have started a war to the extent that World War II became if it was left to their own devices. However, we definitely saw an increase of interest in dictatorships and expansive territorial conquering on the part of these dictators. And they all had these different ideologies which came to define much of the 20th century as a result. So socialism, communism, and fascism, these are all critiques of capitalism. And in the immediate aftermath of World War I, it was thought, maybe capitalism won. But these disputes, maybe socialism and communism are not legitimate. And certainly the monarchies that had fought the Great War, they were mostly capitalist in nature, and that preserved their power or helped preserve their power. And the socialists and communists, they fought them. But socialism, communism, and fascism all grew stronger. And fascism was the new thing. Socialism and communism had been around for well over 100 years prior to about 80 years prior to the Great War. You first hear socialism being talked about in the word being used around 1830, but the ideas of property redistribution and all that really go back to the French Revolution. That's where you really see these ideas in the modern period become powerful. So first we have to define what they are, and first you have to know what capitalism is. And there's Captain America on the eagle there with his money. Capitalism is basically the system that the economic system that the world generally uses today. So capitalism is a cultural system rooted in economic practices that rotate around the imperative of private investors to turn a profit. And that profit usually promotes production efficiencies like the division of labor, economics of size, specialization, the expansion of the market for one's goods, and above all, innovation. That's the general idea of it. But when capitalism works, it works great, and people are pretty happy with it. When it doesn't work great, and people become unhappy with it, and that increases interest in the various critiques. So one of those critiques of capitalism is socialism. There's not one clear definition of socialism, but it generally means an economic system where the means of production, distribution, and exchange are determined by the state or public sector in some form. It can be centralized, decentralized, democratic, or undemocratic. There's a lot of different ways to do socialism, but generally it means that the economy is more controlled by public actors, the public sector, the government. A socialist is a person who believes in that system of government, sees problems with capitalism, and wants to fix them. They do not believe that capitalists voluntarily will fix the various problems that they see with capitalism, so government has to be the mechanism by which things get fixed. A socialist can also be someone who supports such ideas as public health care, a regulated economic market, a smaller divide between rich and poor, and generally a higher tax rate in return for public services. So socialism was basically an argument starting in the 19th century as an outcome of the French Revolution. That argument continued throughout the 19th century. There are various ways to push back on it. For example, Otto von Bismarck pushed back on it. And socialists became very critical of the Great War. They said that capitalism had helped cause the war, that desire for property, desire for profit through property, through selling armaments and so forth, that had helped cause the First World War. And so these people tend to be anti-war critics. And then there's communists, and communists want to go further than socialists in that they believe in more than just the public sector doing economic things. They believe in getting rid of what they see as the source of capitalists' power and control, which is property itself. And so communism is a structure and political ideology which promotes the establishment of an egalitarian, classless, stateless society based on common ownership and control of the means of production and property in general. What the major theorist of communism said, Karl Marx, is that communism can be summed up very briefly in abolish all private property. This goes much further than socialism, obviously. It doesn't mean that there's no property at all. You have personal property, but what it means is control of property as in assets that becomes equally shared. And so real estate, ownership of the various production of the economy, the raw materials, that is owned by everyone through the state. And they didn't explain exactly how this would happen, but it would be some kind of a rotating leadership that derived from the workers, and then everything would get redistributed among the workers. And it never really went into place, but it was something that was pretty popular among revolutionaries in poorer countries, especially countries like Russia that had an absolutist monarchy. The absolutist monarchies seemed to be the worst kind of capitalists, and so they tended to get the worst critics among the communist critics who said that the only way to get rid of this rich, elite, landed nobility class is to get rid of the source of their power, which is the property. And so communists wanted to go a lot further than socialists. So all these arguments were roiling through the 19th century, and then they started roiling during and after the World War. We talked about those communist insurrectionists in Germany, and obviously Russia had the Russian Revolution. So fascism seemed to offer an alternative to all of this. Benito Mussolini was the first fascist, and fascism basically combined some aspects of all of the other ideologies that I just mentioned: socialism, capitalism, and communism. There was an authoritarian nature to it. There was a nationalist factor to it. And what fascism said is that the problem is not exactly the economics, the problem's nationalism, and we need to be more nationalist in order to make our country strong. And strong countries have strong economies and vice versa. And so if you make your country strong and you do that through kind of regimentation and military expansion, then your economy will follow as a matter of course. And so fascism was kind of a combination of all the ideologies that rejected all of them at the same time. Fascists rejected capitalism, socialism, and communism, but they rejected mostly communism. Fascists saw themselves as the antithesis of communists. So the difference between socialists and communists is that the communists were willing to fight. Socialists not always willing to fight. And the communists, though, they were willing to engage revolutions, and they were willing to spill blood in order to bring about those revolutions. So the fascists saw themselves as the vanguard protecting society against that kind of anarchy. And they said there were various ways you do that. You basically don't question your country. You don't question what's right in your country. You be patriotic. And the communists are unpatriotic because they believe in kind of a workers of the world unite kind of thing. And that takes away the country, and this needs to be the integrity of the country has to be protected at all costs, and the way you protect the integrity of the country is you're patriotic. The way you be patriotic is you fight for your country, and when you fight for your country, it becomes strong. You defeat the communists. You also defeat your country's enemies, and it was kind of this dictatorship squared. The kinds of people that were fascists tended to be these dictators who offered alternatives and did so in a charismatic way. And Benito Mussolini was definitely one of those. They offered alternatives to a monarchy, offered alternatives to capitalism, offered alternatives to socialism, offered alternatives to communism. And they basically argued that their package would work better than the others. They were not communists. They were not socialists. They were not capitalists. Fascism was its own thing, and it wasn't quite well defined. But it was a popular movement in this mid-20th century when people were questioning the existing systems that had brought them war and then would bring them the Great Depression.